Hello there, everybody, and welcome to our Chapter 3 on examining roles and roles in the family. If this chapter seemed at all familiar to you, it was really because it is our first real application of family theory and families as systems, which we learned in Chapter 2. We learned about family theory, we learned different types of family theory, and one of the biggest types of theories that will really run its course through this particular chapter is family systems theory. So that was definitely a theory that we learned in Chapter 2 that is helping us understand a lot about what is going on in Chapter 3. So let's go ahead and dive in. There's some key aspects of Chapter 3 that I really want to highlight. And the first thing we're going to talk about are roles. Roles are incredibly important in family communication, because if we're going to see a family and as a system, and each member of that system is a different player with different abilities and different ways to influence one another, we have to examine the roles that are given to them or that they take on and how that impacts the rest of the family. And so roles, as I have here, is defined for you. Roles are socially constructed patterns of behavior and the sets of expectations associated with one's position in the family. What that means is that, one, if you look at that phrase that says socially constructed, what that means is that the family and human beings get together and decide what roles each person will play. And so that's an example of social construction, right? That human beings create these roles and then assign these roles to each other. So one example might be that we assume that those who are female might have to cook or clean. That's a socially constructed role. There's nothing in our natural female biology that would require a female to exclusively clean or cook. That's a social construction that is decided upon by human beings. And the second part of that definition, where it says the sets of expectations associated with that position, is also important because everybody's position in a family is different and every family is unique. And so there will be different expectations put on people who play different roles within the family. So let's go ahead and look at these 4 key vocabulary words I want you to know from our chapter. The first one is role taking. This is when you decide to take on a particular role. Oftentimes the best example of this is parents. So parents, when they find out that they are pregnant or their child is born, they take on the mantle of becoming a parent, right? That's a role that they didn't have before. And then when their first child is born, it's something that they decide that they have to take on. And that can mean deciding and planning to have a child, or that can mean deciding to be more of an active parent and actually be in their child's life. Because as we know, there are quite a number of families that are separated because biological parents, don't act as parents for their children, right? So it is a decision sometimes. You do have to take on that role of being a dad or being a mom or being a grandma, as it were, because it's an active choice. You could be biologically related to someone, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you act as if you are truly their dad or their mom or their grandma or their grandpa. And that is an intra-personal process, meaning, like I said, you make the decision for yourself. Intra means you discuss it with yourself, you talk to yourself about it. And so, as I said, role taking is really a personal choice. It's a choice of deciding that you are going to take on this role. The next one is role evaluation. And so this is when people in the family can discuss how good of a job you are doing at your role. How well is the role being played out? And sometimes we can self-examine intra-personally, like how good of a mom am I being? Or how good of a dad am I being? Am I being a good big brother? Am I really playing this role as best as I can? And it can also happen on an interpersonal level where other people can evaluate you, right? So for example, you might think that you're being a very, very loving auntie, but your nephew might tell you like, hey, auntie, when you raise your voice, you're really scary to me. And so that might make you, as an auntie, reevaluate the way that you are being an aunt to your nephew, right? And so role evaluation can come from other family members, but it can also come from ourselves, where we try to assert how good we are getting at a particular role. The third one is role allocation. This is when when we study how the family has distributed different role behaviors. So we'll talk about this furthermore down the line when we talk about gender and other various impacts that influence how families assign roles to one another. But role allocation simply has to do with the idea of how the family spreads out different roles and behaviors. The last one is role ambiguity, and this is when a person or persons in the family are not sure as to what their family role is, what are the parameters of it, how much is their responsibility, if any, and who is their responsibility to, what other tasks or activities are they responsible for. And that really just means that if you're experiencing role ambiguity, that just means you're not quite sure what's expected of you. All right. So now that we talked a little bit more about roles, let's talk about the various assumptions that we're going to have under our belt as we move forward in this chapter. So the first thing is that roles confer both responsibilities and privileges. What that means is that when you take on a particular role, you take on the role of being mom or uncle or grandma or auntie or big brother or little sister. When you take on those roles, you of course take on responsibilities, and at the same time, it also comes with a degree of privilege, right? You get power because of the responsibility that is given to you. And enacting a role is a process, meaning that very few people, for example, will jump in and magically know how to parent on their first child, right? If anything, a lot of my own students have shared with me that when they had their first child, it was really a learning process of how to be a parent, right? And how to parent in a way that's comfortable for them and positive for their children. And so as families change, we not only see people changing the way they enact their roles, but also for what roles are spread out where, because families change, grow, and modify. Family members are added, family members leave. And so enacting a role is a consistent process, because what might be your role or the definition of your role one year might be vastly different next year when you get a new member of your family, or a member of your family moves away or passes away, or gets too sick and you have to take on new responsibilities. So it's a consistent process, and roles are never static. The third one, expectations influence our roles. This is our own personal set of beliefs that we've internalized, the way that a family member should function in a specific role. One example is that mothers, we've internalized this idea that mothers are supposed to be nurturing, dads give tough love, and all of that kind of, these expectations that we have are not necessarily accurate all the time in reality, nor should they be, but they do influence how we evaluate how well someone is doing in their role. And lastly, roles serve as functions in the family. Again, like I mentioned earlier in this lecture, that's a systems approach to family. It really suggests to us that family experiences are maintained through communication, and that communication helps facilitate interdependency and continued growth in the family, right? So the more roles that you take on and how you share roles and responsibilities with others really helps move your family forward in developing, and really helps, as I said before with my factory example on systems theory, helps the factory keep going, right? Helps it keep producing and moving. So gender roles in families. Gender roles are basically expectations or behaviors associated with masculinity or femininity. And I would like to illustrate right now that none of these roles should be any particular way. We are using the word gender right here because gender is very different from biological sex. Sex is what you are born with as a child, right? Your sexual reproductive organs is your sex. However, your sex doesn't always necessarily match your behavior or your gender presentation. So I want to make that very clear here. And as we study families down the line, there's going to be a lot of variability and a lot of differences in the ways that families express femininity and masculinity. As scholars, it's important to note that we shouldn't just expect femininity from women. Femininity can also come from men, and masculinity can also come from women. So I just want to make that clear before I continue on this discussion. So gender role socialization is the process where men and women learn roles are appropriate for their biological sex. And then I want to say again that there's nothing about our biological sex that says women have to do this and men have to do this. Rather, these are norms that are set by our society that individuals share and that seep into the way a family functions. One example might be a student of mine before has given the example of machismo. And machismo in Hispanic culture refers to this idea that men have to be very hyper masculine, have to be the tough guy, have to dress a certain way, look very masculine, have to provide for the family and be the breadwinner and make the decisions for the family. And a student of mine, a male, talked about how pressured he felt growing up in his family because his father was very much into practicing the idea of machismo, and he himself wasn't a big fan of machismo, and it was even tougher for him when he had to come out as a gay man to his father, and how difficult that was. And so that's just one example of how gender roles permeate through families, and how a family might experience discomfort when other individuals in the family do not conform to those gender rules. It's very important, even though these rules are arbitrary, they still play a huge function in how families see one another and treat one another. Where do we get these ideas? Like I said, these are norms. These gender norms are set by society. But we get them from parents, schools, television, peers, religion, toys. If you've ever been to the toy aisle in Target, I used to say Toys R Us, but now we don't have Toys R Us. Very sad day. But if you go to the toy aisle in Target, there is a very definitively feminine and masculine aisle, right? We have decided for children what toys are okay for boys to play with and okay for girls to play with, right? For example, we usually associate the color pink with girls. We associate dolls with girls. We associate role playing with girls, right? Girls have a lot of role playing toys where they role play cooking dinner or having a kitchen or having a house, and we are socialized into these norms at a very young age. If you look at generic kind of toys that are meant for young boys, you see a lot of cars, you see a lot of darker colors like blue. Very rarely do you see any pink. I don't think I've actually ever seen pink in a toy that was meant for a boy. And so you can see that even in the way we design our toys and what we decide is okay or not okay for a child to play with is already teaching that child their gender norms, right? They're learning at a very young age what's okay for boys to do, what's okay for girls to do. And schools, of course, are a big part of that. Television's a huge part of that as well. Various TV shows, even children's shows, will normalize certain gender norms or not normalize certain gender norms as well. Next up is a gender schema theory. And this theory is one of our very first coming out of the gate in chapter 3 that I want you to focus on. And gender schema theory really says that we have to be able to understand how masculinity and femininity, our schema, our way of organizing people, play into the family. And it's really important, and it pairs so well with systems theory because if we assume, for example, that at a systems theory level, every person in the family has to play their role and play their part correctly, another layer we add to that is gender schema theory, which helps us understand, are you playing your role or your part the way you are expected to as a female or a male? Right? So gender schema theory really calls our attention to focus on the ways in which gender plays a huge role in how we assess other people in our family, how we assign roles to people in our family. And gender schema theory really helps us understand the impact of how the world and ultimately the family unit is organized around masculine and feminine behaviors. One video example that I absolutely love that I think is quite helpful is this video. And so if you are looking at my slides, you can actually play this video. And this video is a short documentary. It's about maybe 15 to 20 minutes. And it's about young girls growing up in Bangladesh. And the reason I'm showing it to you is because these young girls in Bangladesh are required to be married very often at very young ages, from the ages of 13, 14, 15. And what we're learning from this video and why it's important is because the way that gender and culture and families interact is incredibly important. In this particular area of Bangladesh, women in general are not seen as valuable. They are not seen as individuals that are capable of getting an education or doing really anything more than just being housewives. And not that being a housewife is bad, but when the only choice for a woman is to be a housewife, then that creates problematic issues within the family itself. If you watch this documentary, it follows the story of a young girl who says that she wants to be a doctor. However, her mother is marrying her off to an older man. This girl is about 13 years old, and her mother is marrying her off to about a man that's about 25 years old. And so the interviewers ask, why are you marrying your daughter off? She clearly wants to go to school and wants to pursue her dream of becoming a doctor. And the mother responded that girls are simply too expensive in our society to have. It's too expensive to send her to school, and it's too expensive to keep her at home. And so the only way to ensure that her daughter is able to have a sustainable life is by marrying her off to a family that she knows will take care of her. And in this society, when the daughter is married off, the daughter's family is the one that provides gifts to the future groom's family as well, as a way to almost thank the groom for taking on the burden of this young girl. And so this is just one example out of many worldwide and in the United States that I could provide that help us understand how gender schemas or gender expectations impact the decisions that families make. Because we can understand from this video that if women in this society as a whole were valued more and seen as more capable and given more resources, the need to marry these girls off at such a young age would be not as prominent anymore, right? And so we see in societies like these, where these gender schemas are skewed, the only value a woman really has is to be married, right? And so it is quite unfortunate, but it's a great example of this idea. And of course, the same goes on the opposite spectrum for males as well. With my example of machismo, there's a lot of expectations that are placed on men in various cultural contexts. And of course, just like women and just like all human beings, we can't always live up to the expectations that others set for us, nor do we want to, and nor is it truly us. And so as family scholars, it's important for us to recognize the expectations that are put on to a family by the society that the family lives in, as well as how the family mitigates those challenges or responds to those societal norms, right? So now let's move on to rules in family communication. And rules can be both implicit or explicit, meaning that they can be explicitly said, like, you need to go to bed by 9, or you need to say thank you every time someone gives you something. If you're explicitly told verbally that something has to happen or that you need to do something in your family, it's an explicit rule. However, rules can also be implicit. Sometimes family members don't need to be told how to do everything. Sometimes family members just know, right? So for example, when I go over to a friend's house and my friend is eating dinner, and they, before dinner, bow their heads and say grace, I know that that's an implicit rule, right? No one really has to tell everybody else, hey, it's time to say grace. Everybody just knows to do it, right? So it's a more implicit rule that is kind of ingrained into the family. And I follow along with that implicit rule. When I see everybody else do it, I understand that I have to participate as well in order to show respect. So rules are followable, meaning that we can opt to follow them or not. And your textbook makes a great point of that. Not everybody in a family chooses to follow rules, and not all rules are adhered to. But ultimately, rules are important because they prescribe behavior that is either obligated, preferred, or prohibited. Obligated meaning that behavior you're required to do. Preferred meaning behavior that is preferred or they wish you would do, or prohibited meaning behavior they don't want you to do. And rules are contextual, meaning that rules can change from context to context, right? That in certain contexts it's okay and to do something or say something, in another context it's not. So for example, you might think your parents might totally let you wrestle with your siblings and play at home, but if you have guests over, the context changes, and now there's a rule that you can't wrestle and you can't roughhouse at home with your siblings. Does that make sense? So when we get contexts that change, different rules can apply. And rules, of course, are passed down from generation to generation, and not every rule is passed down to every generation, but typically that is how they are shared. And one example I have for you here is from the movie Fences. And in this movie, a father and a son are having a conversation, and the son, now kind of a young adult, asks his father, why do I feel like you just never liked me, right? And his father responds very attentively, I don't have to like you, right? I ain't got to like you. My job is not to like you. My job is to make sure that you have a roof over your head, and that you have a bed to sleep in, and that you have food. It's not because I like you, it's because it's my job, right? He sees it as both a rule and a role of himself to do that. And so while this isn't a typical family conversation, I think it's a great conversation piece for a lot of families who might experience similar conversations with their children, or whose children might experience this with their parents, because rules are important, right? So I love how he says, I don't have to like you. This is just the job, right? This is the job of being a father. And that's an implicit rule for him. All right, so as I said, rules can be explicit or implicit. Rules evolve over time. So rules, just like roles, are never static. They don't change all the time. So they do evolve, though, and they do change. Typically, what we see is from generation to generation. And also, if we look at developmental theory, we find that they also change when big events happen in the family, right? We also see that rules work best when they consider the needs of individual family members. Rules have to take into account that each family member is different and unique, and is capable of different things and wants different things, right? And so because of that, it's important to provide those individual members an option to discuss those rules. And rules, as I just mentioned, are affected by cultural trends that are outside of the family, that live within society, and that family rules ultimately are a reflection of the rules and expectations of the larger society and culture that a family lives in. So let's talk about the different types of rules. So we have 3 major rules that I want you to know. There are rules on governing what can be talked about. There's rules on governing how things can be talked about, and rules governing on who can hear things. So let's break that down. First, your family might have rules on what you can talk about. Sometimes, for example, if there's been a tough death in the family, there might be an implicit rule that you just don't talk about it. Like, you don't mention, your grandpa or someone who has passed away, because it's hurtful for the family to hear. So what can be talked about is cut off, right? When you probably should not bring up the death of your grandfather. The second one is rules governing how things can be talked about. And remember that process, how things happen, is just as important as what happens. And so maybe it's okay that you bring up certain topics in front of your parents, but how you do it is just as important, and there might be rules on how you do it. So for example, you might want to talk to your parents about going on a field trip, but they might get really mad at you if you interrupt their conversation on the phone so that you can ask their permission to go on this field trip, right? So it's not that they're upset you talked about the field trip. It's more that how you did it was inappropriate in your parents' eyes. And a lot of parents, for example, teach their children that it's not okay to interrupt adults when they're talking. That's an example of how things can be talked about, right? How you bring things up. the context in which they're brought up and the tone in which they're brought up. And the third one is rules governing who can hear things. Sometimes parents don't want to, for example, fight in front of their children. So they'll purposely make a rule with one another. Spouses will make a rule that, oh, well, let's not fight in front of the kids. Sometimes children are shielded from different topics, right? And sometimes other family members are shielded from different topics as well. And what that tells us is that we are comfortable expressing certain topics to certain family members, and a family might have a wider ranging rule that says, no, this is great, but I don't really want the children to hear this, or I don't really want grandpa to hear that, right? And that can be tough. One example I can give you is one of my close friends. His grandmother, unfortunately, was passing away. She was very ill, and the doctor told her family that she had maybe perhaps a month left to live. And so the family now has to make this decision, right, on how she will continue to live on. Will she live in the hospital? Will they bring her home? What are her wishes? What does she want to do? And at the time, she had had a stroke and other complications, and so it was incredibly hard for her to communicate her desires and her own needs. So the family communicated about this particular topic. Now, they did not permit the younger children to be in on the conversation. So that's an example of number 3, the rules governing who can hear things. So they didn't want the children to be part of that, the younger children to be part of that conversation. And so my friend at the time was a young adult, right? He was in his 20s, and so he was in on the conversation on what to do now that his grandmother was very ill and was about to pass away. And he was an aspiring pharmacist at the time, a clinician. He is a pharmacist now, and he, of course, because he thinks very logically and medically, he felt that the best thing to do would be to let her be comfortable in the hospital and ask her if she would like euthanasia or like the opportunity to end her life early so that she doesn't suffer for another month in the pain that she was in. And when he mentions this to his family immediately did not like that idea. They said, you can't even mention the idea of offering her euthanasia or an opportunity to end her own life. So that's an example of rule number 1, right? They said, we don't even want to hear. There's a rule that we're just not even going to discuss. Giving her an opportunity to end her life early, right? And so he got very frustrated, and he said, why not? I feel like if we asked her, we should at least ask her and give her this opportunity, regardless of the fact that she is, not really able to communicate right now. And he, in his anger and frustration, was raising his voice to his parents. And they said, okay, now you're out of the conversation completely because we don't like how you're bringing this idea up either. And that's rule number 2, right? So rules are important. And so even though I'm very sure my friend had all the best intentions for his grandmother and truly wanted her to be happy and comfortable in the way that he envisioned for that, there are rules in his family that made it so that he couldn't really bring up those points of conversation. And they also didn't like the way he would bring up those points of conversation either. And so it's really difficult. And so as a result, when we are limited in the things that we can say and who we say them to, we get secrets. We get individual secrets, we get internal secrets, and we get shared secrets in families. And one example I want to give you right here is from the movie Little Miss Sunshine, where she asked her uncle, why did you want to kill yourself? Because her uncle in the movie had attempted to kill himself after a series of really devastating events in his life. And I want you to pay attention to how the little girl, her parents are split on the decision. One parent wants her to hear the answer and wants her to ask the question, and the other parent says, no, it's not appropriate for a young girl to be asking that question or to even be hearing this conversation. Again, going back to rules 1, 2, and 3. And so it's very interesting to kind of see this family dynamic, and it's a great example of how rules can dictate the ways in which families communicate. And that is it. Chapter 3, short and simple and sweet to the point, which is a great breath of fresh air, I'm sure, for you from chapter 2. And I know that this seems like a lot of text, and the chapter itself is really long, but it's long because it's full of great examples of rules and roles. And really what I want you to get from this is threefold. I want you to understand the definition of roles, why they're important in families, and how they are assigned, evaluated, and allocated. I want you to understand the different types of rules, both explicit and implicit, and I want you to understand how rules and roles, combined with culture and gender expectations, affect a family's decisions internally on the roles and the rules that they have, and how it affects them externally as they interact with the society around them. So I hope this lecture has been helpful, and if you have any questions, I'm always happy to answer your questions or build on some more of the topics that I discussed today. Bye, everybody.